Welcome to our program today called Burning Man, Art and Technology, sponsored by Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the American West and the Stanford Arts Institute. My name is Mark Levin, and I am the lead organizer for ArtsWest, a program affiliated with the Lane Center that places a spotlight on the arts and humanities in the American West. You can learn more about ArtsWest by visiting us online at artswest.stanford.edu. Today, we explore a uniquely Western and global phenomenon in the arts known as Burning Man, an annual late summer gathering in the Black Rock Desert of Northwest Nevada that attracts more than 75,000 people. The purpose of our program will be to explore the creative spirit of Burning Man as an original Western cultural movement and its innovative paradigm of art as a participatory and interactive experience, not attached to traditional museums or commercial art markets. Technology has increasingly become a component of Burning Man art. We intend to explore the affinity between art and technology with the rise of Silicon Valley and the parallel evolution of the Burning Man movement. Both are pillars of contemporary art and technology based in the Bay Area that have a global reach. Our four distinguished speakers today explore this uniquely Western cultural happening as the world's largest intentional outdoor art show. The keynote address will focus on the cultural and maker movement aspects of Burning Man and its synergy with the rise of Silicon Valley, fueling the opportunity for new development and beta testing at Black Rock City in the spirit of utopian art. The other three presenters will trace the evolution of the Burning Man movement from a beachside festival to a temporary full city, exploring the linkage between the art and the technology, the institutional and curatorial responses to the art produced there, and its organizational challenges, successes, and ethos. Our speakers are profiled in your printed program and will appear in the following order. Fred Turner, Professor of Communication at Stanford University. Professor Turner's keynote address is entitled, What Burning Man Does for Silicon Valley. Scott London of Scott London Photography. His address is entitled, The Ephemeral City, Reflections on a Decade of Burning Man Photography. Nora Atkinson, Curator of Craft at the Smithsonian Museum's Renwick Gallery. Her address is entitled, When the Man Met the Man, Burning Man's Journey from the Desert to the Museum. And lastly, Catherine K. Chen, Associate Professor of Sociology at CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Her address is entitled, Communities, How Burning Man Catalyzes Creativity and the Arts. Each of the four speakers will have 30 minutes for their presentations. There will be no formal audience Q&A. However, feel free to approach our distinguished speakers with your questions after we close the formal program at 4 p.m. We are video recording the event for later rebroadcasting on the Lane Center website. Please quiet your mobile phones during the event. May I have the second slide, please? I want to thank the following organizations for their support for this event. The Burning Man Organization, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, Profiles in Dust, Scott London Photography, and Studio Drift. I also want to thank my colleagues at Stanford who made this program a possibility. First, from the Bill Lane Center, Professor Bruce E. Kane, the Center Director. Thank you, Bruce, for your leadership and belief in ArtsWest and me. And the administrative team at the Center, Preeti Hetmeyer, Stephanie Burbank, Catherine Wright, Jeff McGee, and Alexandra Mack Taylor. Second, the Stanford Arts Institute, our program partner, under the wise leadership of Professor Peggy Fellon as the Institute's director, and to Becky Ormiston for recruiting a wonderful group of Stanford students to be with us today in the audience. I now turn our program over to my colleague, Fred Turner.
Yikes. That is truly terrifying. Can you put Larry back up? All right. Much better, thanks. So thank you for having me here today. I'm absolutely thrilled. I want to thank Mark and thank Stanford and thank the DeYoung. And I particularly want to thank Stanford because 10 years ago, in 2006, I was an assistant professor interested in studying Burning Man. And Stanford put me through an institutional review board to see if it would be appropriate for me to go to the desert. And it was actually pretty rigorous. So my first time in the desert, I went out with a little piece of paper from the IRB that I had to give to everyone I spoke to for an interview. If you've ever tried to give out a form at Burning Man, yeah, enough said. I'm absolutely delighted that Stanford has seen its way clear to celebrating Burning Man as the cultural phenomenon that it is. I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of that. So I came to Burning Man not through Burning Man itself. I had studied the counterculture and its impact on the tech world, and I had written a book very much focused on sort of 60s, 70s, 80s computing. And a friend of mine had me over to Google one day in 2006, and when I walked in the front door, this is what I saw. I'd never heard of this thing. Now, I had been studying things like IBM, and I was really expecting to get to Google, this new tech firm, and see people with maybe like little think signs on their desks, as they would have been an IBM. And I absolutely couldn't understand why they had pictures like this all through the opening area, the main building through which you had to enter the firm. Now, as you'll know if you're in the corporate world, corporations are incredibly careful about the images that they show in that front room when everybody comes into the building. This is what Google wanted to show in 2006. And I really just had no idea why. I had never heard of fire spinning, didn't know what went on in the desert. And it got me thinking, what did Burning Man have to do with this company? Why was Burning Man, which I understood at the time to be just sort of a festival in the desert, so central to the life of this firm that they would decorate their opening entryway with images from the event? And I got to ask a little bit farther, what did this have to do with Silicon Valley? Particularly as I started exploring the festival and went and saw the art and got dusty, I had to wonder, what does this have to do with a world that I understand to be somewhat macho, somewhat male-centered, somewhat tech-driven, with these kinds of folks in it? All right, my mission today is to give you an answer to that question in 3 eras. I think Burning Man has paralleled the rise of Silicon Valley and in many ways helped drive that rise. I'll give you the heads up. This is the conclusion today, so just give it right straight up. I'm going to argue that Burning Man is to contemporary modes of manufacturing in Silicon Valley what the Protestant church was to industrial production in the era of Henry Ford. I sense a mixed reaction. I'll work it through as best I can, and I'd be delighted to talk with folks afterwards. In the 19th century and early 20th century, if you lived in Michigan and you went to a Protestant church with members of your factory, the Protestant church itself would actually arrange you in the patterns that reflected the structure of the firm where you worked. You would have Henry and his family up front, you'd have middle managers right behind him, and then you would have workers. I'm going to argue that the peer-based, project-centered world of Burning Man mirrors and legitimates the peer-based project world of engineering and the particular styles of engineering that drive Silicon Valley. That's the argument. Okay, so let's take it piece by piece. Let's start with the 1990s. Here's a familiar face. It's interesting. In the 1990s, Burning Man had been going for a decade. It starts in, I think, 86. And it had begun to attract all kinds of folks from the tech world. And Larry Harvey himself was careful to say in a number of settings that Burning Man was itself something like the tech world. I gradually realized that this place we've created is a physical analog to the internet. That's quite a claim. physical analog to the internet. But a lot of people believed it. In the 1990s, we were still in that kind of utopian moment when it suddenly seemed like we could build the kind of countercultural, peer-to-peer, playful, collaborative, community-centered world that we had hoped for at least since the 1960s. Then we enter the early aughts, and this is when I first encounter Burning Man. And in the early aughts, the tech world changes. The kind of internet that was developed in the late 1990s morphs fairly quickly into what we now understand to be social media, highly interactive, platform-based settings in which people are starting to cooperate and collaborate, sometimes without much money or any money at all, as in Wikipedia, and other times, as in large-scale open source software projects, for a mix of motives, sometimes profit-oriented, sometimes not. What I want to do now is bear down on that period and tell a couple of stories. It's going to get real sociological for the next 10 minutes. Hang with me. Students, this is just like my lectures, okay? All right. So, in the middle aughts, about 2006, a sociologist named Yochai Benkler at Yale University coins a term that describes how engineering is organized both on the internet, on different platforms, and inside a lot of internet firms. He calls it commons-based peer production. And to do this kind of work, you don't arrange your company in a hierarchy. You don't have levels. What you have instead is a space, just an open commons of some kind. And in that space, you have a leveled arrangement of people, leveled management. People kind of coordinate rather than dominate. And as a key feature, you have interpersonal visibility. You have to be able to see one another to know who's capable of doing what. You also have to have subsidy. Somebody has to be paying the bills. Now, they're either paying the bills for the thing that you're doing in that common space, or you've earned your money somewhere else and you've been given this common space as a kind of outside, what sometimes sociologists call a heterotopia, a place outside normal life. Finally, this is also key, a commons-based peer production system of manufacturing requires that it be, in some sense, not understood as a site of manufacturing. It needs to be understood as a community. Because only in a community can you begin to blend the interpersonal, the character tests, and the professional skill sets that make this kind of world work. Now, commons-based peer production, as Benkler showed, was a dominant feature of open source projects, of projects like Wikipedia, even of Second Life. And as I began to explore the world inside Google, it became clear that it was a feature of Google's internal organization as well. So Google engineering, as you can see, featured leveled management. It was very much an engineer's first company. This is 2006. It's changed a bit since then. Are there Googlers in the audience? Yeah, okay, I got one or two. Good, great, thanks. There were very clear efforts by management to create commons spaces in the firm. These included online email lists. Offices were jammed up together in Mountain View, so you might have 3 engineers in a room. They had enough money to spread the engineers out. They didn't want to. They wanted them to see one another, to collaborate, to build things together. Likewise, lots of interpersonal visibility, lots of cafes, lots of ways to circulate, meet one another. Subsidy. This is really interesting. Marissa Mayer, who worked at Google at the time, talked about 20% time. Engineers were offered 20% time to work on projects of their own choice. Now, as you might imagine, there was some attention to projects oriented toward things that might be good for the company. In fact, in 2006, more than 50% of the new products Google introduced were first developed in 20% time. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It also had, much more than I would have ever expected, a communal ethos. When I first visited Google in 2006, it did not feel like the companies I had studied in the 50s and 60s. It felt like kind of a weird cross between, a little bit of a dorm, a little bit of a commune, a little bit of a hackathon. It was very social. It felt very collaborative. It felt very much like a community. That community ethos was very productive for generating new goods. And one of my favorites of this is Google News. Let me just show you how Google News came into being, and I think you'll see the power of commons-based peer production. So, so in 9/11, an engineer named Krishna Bharat is seeking news about the 9/11 events. And he ends up writing a script. He's a very capable programmer. He writes a script that allows him to sort of scrape the web and create a news feed of stories being produced by newspapers around the world about 9/11. Now, in an ordinary hierarchical firm, he might just have kept that to himself, shared it with his office mates, made it sort of a personal tool. But on the commons that Google had established, he put it out as a gift to the Google community. He said, here's a thing I found kind of useful. I hope you guys can find it useful too. And he put it out on an internal email list. Now, Marissa Mayer and her team saw that. They monitored that list. And they thought, now that's an interesting product. And the next thing you know, they developed Google News. So where's Burning Man in all of this? I'm going to argue that Burning Man in 2006 is an epicenter for the celebration of commons-based peer production. I was really surprised when I got to Burning Man by the power of the 10 principles, the power of the communal ethos. But I was also struck by the structural similarity to what I had observed inside Google. We had a huge commons, a wide open desert. We had intense individual presentation. I could present my individuality in whatever guise I thought of. I would give gifts and receive gifts. I enjoyed subsidy. I couldn't spend any money on the playa, but boy, I spent some money getting there. Yeah. And somebody was, paying the bills somewhere. I had earned enough money somewhere else in my life to be able to go to Burning Man. And it also featured a kind of immediacy that I recognized a little bit from the tech world. And I went out there with the goal of interviewing people who were active out there. And I began to see, as I moved around camp to camp, the logic of peer production and project-based peer production especially. People would see one another, get to know one another off playa or on, do things together that were enormously powerful. And this is, of course, building the man. I began to interview people who worked in Silicon Valley extensively to sort of figure out what it was they were getting out of this. And there are two stories that I want to tell you. The first story I want to tell you is about a guy named Greg McNichol. Some of you might know him. Greg, are you here? Okay. It's very odd to talk about people if they're actually sitting there. So Greg, back in 2006, was a 55-year-old computer animator. I won't tell you what firm he worked for, but you've seen its movies. And he went to Burning Man to do a kind of pyrotechnic project with a team, and they'd been working on it, off playa, beginning months before the project. And I said, well, so why do you do this? I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work. You're really hot. You're really dusty. If you don't put the right lotion on, the dust eats your flesh. And he said, well, part of the fun is having a dream about something, building it, seeing it work, and seeing it work is just a real high. And he really liked how he worked with people. He said, the people on my team were people like me, very focused, very few words, open to anything, no egos. We worked very tightly as a team. We were open to very intense, focused energy all the time. It was obsessive, exciting. You were not taking care of your physical needs. So not taking care of your physical needs is a sort of signature feature of engineering in Silicon Valley. Where I'm going with this is that for Greg McNichol, doing this work in the desert rehearsed the principles that he was supposed to have at work in Silicon Valley. Collaboration, teamwork, intense connection to one another. But this time, he was the boss. He was making something beautiful. He wasn't making code to, serve a firm. He was making something that others would see and that would be expressive and from himself. I would argue that this experience of ecstatic labor is a kind of vocational ecstasy. It is an ecstatic expression of the values that you should be experiencing in your workplace but are not. Not unlike the Protestant church once gave voice to hopes for community and collective ambition and mission that were not realized in the factory. Second story, these kinds of networks, as anyone who's been on these teams from the Valley knows, have a real impact on your social and professional connections once you leave the Valley. Talk about the mad scientists. I'm not sure the mad scientists are still out there, but between 1998 and about 2008, they were very active in building light systems right around the man. And they worked together all year. They were a group of engineers based in Silicon Valley, kind of 10 or 12 core people, and another 100 people whom they called the cloud, before the cloud was the cloud. And they came together on these weekends and built large-scale systems. They ended up getting some grants from Burning Man and building large-scale lighting systems. And one year they went $20,000 over budget. And they didn't ask the Burning Man organization for anything. Like a good consulting firm, they ate it and made the thing. And it's a fairly high-tech thing that they were making. They were making sort of a plastic tube of integrated lighting inside and attached to plastic that would go around the man and make the boundary to keep people from rushing into the fire. And it was a fairly sophisticated project. And when they left the playa, of course, they left the playa not just with all the memories of having done that beautiful project and the ecstatic experience of seeing it work in the dust. They left the playa with a very robust professional network. When I went to the playa in 2007 or 2008, I left with more business cards than I had ever received at a conference. Now, I know that's not supposed to happen out there, but I kept having this experience because I was in research mode, right? I was presenting in character, but the character was Stanford sociologist, okay? And then once people found out I was from Stanford and was interested in this stuff, I would often get taken into a back room and handed a card. That was fascinating. That told me a lot. So there's been a lot of talk in the press about Burning Man today being, kind of a jet-setting desert resort. Anybody who can write that has never been. But it has changed. It has changed. I went back in 2017, hadn't been there really in a decade, and was really surprised that some of the anti-commercialism that dominated my experience in 06, 07 had really vanished. And the level of wealth out there was not something I had really seen or noticed anyways before. It's 70,000 people plus now. The party starts day one. That kind of quiet few days that used to sort of fire it up, gone, just instant partying. And Marianne Goodell, has in her recent blog post, the cultural course correcting blog post, has written about some of the things that have happened out there. There's been some commodification on the playa. People are launching products out there. People are attending in very much in a consumerist mode. I know the last time I went out, I met all these club kids from Ibiza, and they were terrifying. They were completely beautiful. They were the most beautiful people I had ever seen close up. No, they were beautiful. Their bodies were like, well, do you remember what disco bunnies looked like in the 70s and 80s? A little too much coke, thin, dancing. That's who those people were. And in addition to that, we have plug-and-play camps. We have Sherpas, experienced burners serving as Sherpas to the wealthy. These things are pretty out of sync, as Miriam pointed out, with the original design and culture of the festival. And she says, Burning Man is not a festival. So I don't actually think of this as primarily a Burning Man problem. I think of this as a problem that's occurring across our culture in relation to developments in the technological world. So, yes, now we have these large concerts, we have events, but the business model of Silicon Valley has actually changed since the early aughts. A woman named Shoshana Zuboff, one of the first women ever tenured at the Harvard Business School, has written a marvelous book, which I completely recommend to anyone, called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, in which she maps out the new ways that Silicon Valley is making money. The way that Silicon Valley makes money, these are companies, social media companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter, is that they actually create situations online that generate behaviors. So you do things. You go on your Facebook page, you share a photo, you contact a friend, and that's offered to you as a kind of chance to express yourself as a person. But as you do that, you get watched. And you're being watched not just for the behavior that you're doing, not just for the picture that you're sending or whatever. You're being watched for the patterns of behavior, your patterns of interaction. And that patterning is being recorded. If you haven't read your end user license agreement at Facebook, it's worth the time. Once your particular behaviors are committed online, solicited by the pleasure of sharing with your friends, they're recorded and then they're combined with other like behaviors to begin to assemble a profile of you and the type of person that you are. That in turn, that combination, that new data set, receives machine learning, meaning machine learning sounds so fancy, right? It sounds like there's a sort of semi-hominid machine in a back room somewhere learning. It's much simpler than that. It's basically computers applying patterned mathematics to very large data sets and then in turn discovering new patterns. Those patterns in turn become the patterns on which companies that want to sell you things can develop ads targeted to those people who match the part of the pattern that they want. And that's how Facebook makes its money. That's how other firms make their money. Facebook does not make its money selling you the opportunity to connect with your friends. On the contrary, it offers you the opportunity to connect with your friends so it can watch. And in watching, not just watching in the classic voyeuristic sense, but so that it can watch, map your behaviors, and then in real time, in real digital high-speed time, sell that map, sell your location on the grid to an advertiser that wants to sell you goods. That in turn allows, of course, these firms to have extraordinary influence, not simply in the commercial sphere, but as we've lately seen in the political sphere as well. And that in turn leads to more behavior of a particular kind. My point here is that in this condition, in this economic environment, self-expression has taken on an entirely new valence. Burning Man today is a community and at the same time a platform. It's a platform for performative self-expression. It's a platform, I can't think of a better platform for the making and distributing of images. I mean, the blue sky out there is like nothing, right? I mean, Burning Man has become a platform for expressive labor. It is not anymore only a space for the collaborative build-out of peer production of the kind that's celebrated at Google. It's a space in which peer production, collaborative labor on projects, and personal self-expression, committed through costuming, through colorful art cars, all that creativity can be fused and turned not only into amazing art on the playa, but into the photographs that fill our Instagram accounts, our Facebook accounts, online platforms everywhere. And these in turn generate the behavior on which these companies depend in an era of surveillance capitalism. I would argue that what some of the problems that Marion has flagged on the playa today are problems that are emerging as surveillance capitalism does its work and as people profit from it. And I would argue that some of the pleasures of creativity and individual self-expression, the very freedoms that we enjoy in the bounded space of Burning Man, are models of the new productive behaviors that surveillance capitalism needs to work. You make more pictures, you make more connections, you meet more people, you collaborate more. You produce more interaction, which can in turn be monitored, mapped, and resold for the purpose of advertising. Now, I don't think Burning Man, I don't think, obviously there are not airplanes flying over Burning Man mapping your behavior, okay? But I will say that at Burning Man, I learned to watch in a different way. And Burning Man is a place where so much can be seen. And it's sort of wonderful that way. Suddenly the world that you inhabit, sometimes emotionally and internally, is available to you as a city. And that's amazing. I'll never forget driving way out into the dust, middle of the night, looking back and seeing what looked like a gas station sign with a red heart right in the middle as it twirled around saying love. Like, that was beautiful. Well, I've been visiting Facebook lately, and like Google, they have extraordinary art inside. And it's art designed to help you feel like a creative bohemian. It's art designed to help you feel like they're not a company, they're a community. Burning Man is a community, but it's a community, I would argue, whose values and whose behaviors inadvertently celebrate and arguably legitimize new modes of manufacturing. And this brings us back to where I started. Burning Man is an extraordinary, even religious experience. It finds its way into some of your deepest, most personal parts, and it shows you ways of living together and being together and collaborating together and playing together and loving together that you may not have seen ever before in your life and certainly don't see in your everyday. And I love it for that. But like the Protestant church of the 19th century, Burning Man is also a place that channels our desires, our most personal drives, our most creative energies into modes of collaboration, into ways of ordering our bodies in relation to one another and in relation to a greater set of beliefs that is entirely in sync with the dominant industrial paradigm of our era. And that's a paradox. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Mark Levin and and Stephanie Burbank and everybody at the Bill Lane Center for having me here today. It's great to see such a great turnout here at the DeYoung. I started making photographs at Burning Man about 15 years ago. And what I'd like to do today is share some of the images that I've made and some of the insights that have come out of the project. Let me begin by saying that when I first heard about Burning Man in the mid-90s, I had no real interest in going. I had seen pictures of people doing wild and crazy things in the desert, and I decided that it wasn't for me. I thought if I ever make it out to the Black Rock Desert, it'll be to enjoy the beauty and the serenity of the place, not to share it with tens of thousands of other people. But in the year 2000, my girlfriend went and came back the following year insisting that we go together. And I put up a lot of resistance, but eventually I came around and I agreed to go with her, which of course is hilarious in retrospect because I've been going ever since. We arrived at Burning Man that first year in a full-on whiteout, which of course only confirmed my sense that going out there was a complete mistake. But after the winds died down and the dust settled a bit, we got ourselves out and began taking it all in. And it struck me almost immediately that Burning Man was less of a festival in the traditional sense and more of a visionary experiment. It seemed to me that there were stories to tell out there. Stories about creativity, about the power of interactive art, about how to design spaces to maximize interaction between people, about the principles of gifting and free exchange, about self-expression and what it means to experiment with new identities. I felt that these were ideas worth sharing, but it wasn't clear to me as a journalist how best to do that. I didn't want to write a long feature article about my experience at Burning Man. For one thing, there were already lots of articles like that in print, some of them written by brilliant writers and thinkers, cultural icons like Kevin Kelly and Bruce Sterling. But even if I were up to the task of writing a decent piece, I wasn't sure that words were the right medium for what I wanted to convey. Burning Man is such a kaleidoscopic visual experience. Mark Morford, columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, once described it as nonstop visual orgasmica. Words alone, I felt, just couldn't do it justice. So I came up with the idea of doing a photo essay, combining images and text. I wanted to have people describe the Burning Man experience in their own words. And of course, the photo essay is a tried and true journalistic method. There was just one problem. I wasn't much of a photographer. I was a writer and a radio journalist. I had an early love affair with photography as a teenager, and I went on to study it in college, but then I put the camera aside and started focusing on other things. So I returned to Burning Man the following year with a pair of decent cameras, and I spent 8 full days doing interviews, taking notes, making pictures. And at the end of that week, looking over the photos and all the voluminous notes that I'd taken, it became increasingly clear to me that the images stood on their own. They didn't need any captions. Words seemed unnecessary. And this was a powerful moment for me as a journalist, a very humbling one. And from that moment forward, I concentrated just on making pictures. Now, it wasn't lost on me that being a photographer at Burning Man violates one of the essential principles and the essential spirit of the event. Unlike a traditional festival where you go to be entertained in some way, where there's a clear boundary between the participant and, or the performer rather, and the audience, Burning Man is entirely participant-driven. Everybody contributes something to the overall experience. Susan Sontag, the great writer and social critic, once said that photography has become one of the principal devices for experiencing something, for giving an appearance of participation. But, she said, and I love this line, the camera makes everyone a tourist. If you're taking pictures, you're not really immersed in what's going on. You can't really participate while at the same time you're standing on the sidelines making pictures. So I'm very mindful of that as a photographer. At the same time, I recognize that photography can be a medium of artistic expression. It can also be a very powerful vehicle for conveying meaning if you've got something to say. Photography can show without telling. It can convey without interpreting. Even though, of course, I realize that every photograph represents an act of framing and an act of interpretation on the part of the artist. And in any case, I really didn't need to worry much about the cameras getting in the way of participating, because at Burning Man, people never tire of reminding you that you should put your cameras down periodically and just get out and experience the event. Something which I actually carve out time to do every day that I'm at Burning Man. By the way, I should mention that in the bio that appears in the program for this event, I'm described as an official Burning Man photographer. And that's not actually true. I'm not an official. Burning Man doesn't have official photographers, which is something I really love about the event. It means that all of us are amateurs out there. I do volunteer for the Burning Man organization, and I let them use my images, but I'm not in any way tied to the Burning Man organization. I just work for myself. So Burning Man, as we know, can be very difficult to describe. No one seems to know quite what to call it. Some people call it a public art festival. It's been called a new American underground, countercultural convergence, whimsical fairyland, a flea market Las Vegas, Disneyland in reverse. For me, the phrase that comes closest to describing it is an experiment in temporary community. This phrase captures the fact that it's an experiment and that it's ephemeral. It's not a place that you go, in other words, it's an experience that you have. One that lasts a few days, and then when it's over, all that's left are the memories, and hopefully a few good photos. But unfortunately, the media have persisted in framing the event as nothing more than a kind of bacchanalian orgy in the desert. The focus tends to be on the nudity, the drugs, the excess, the self-indulgence of it all. Case in point, Time magazine once called it one of the most unbridled examples of 21st century self-indulgence. But as a journalist, I saw a very different story playing out when I first arrived at Burning Man. I felt that spinning it as a big desert rave missed the significance of the event as a kind of test tube experiment. Let me mention just a few of the aspects of the event that struck me as fascinating and underreported. One of them, which I've already alluded to, is the idea that everyone is a participant. You have to get in on the action. Don't stand on the sidelines. This idea of participation, I think, doesn't seem that radical on the face of it, but when you look at how little time we actually spend in our culture doing that, our recreational activities are almost entirely passive. What we do is we spectate. We go to a ball game and watch from the stands, or we sit on the couch and stare at our televisions, or we go through our Instagram feed, always looking at what other people are doing, often kind of looking in from the outside. So this is an entirely different proposition. Don't go to Burning Man to be entertained. Go to Burning Man to be the entertainment. Another storyline is the power of creative placemaking. At Burning Man, everybody's making stuff, whether it's a big theme camp, a janky art car, beautiful temple. The whole place is like a giant maker's fair, a haven for techies, gearheads, and mad geniuses. The act of building and creating something together is a powerful way to build bonds, create community. I know a lot of burners, in fact, Ted Turner was just mentioning this in his keynote, who they come just for the build. By the time the gates open and everybody starts to arrive, they pack up and leave. They're not there for the party. They're there for the barn raising, for the chance to spend time with a group of friends and build something together. Another core aspect of the event, one that I don't think people pay sufficient attention to, is the fact that no money changes hands at the event. I'm on the wrong slide here. There's the Pickle Palace. He's handing out free pickles out at the temple one morning. No money changes hands at the event. Now, of course, it takes money to get out to Burning Man. There's no doubt about it. But how great that you can get out there and spend a whole week without ever having to take your wallet out. It's amazing. This is Brother Baker and his Lovin' Oven. He brought it all the way from Brooklyn so that he could take it out to the temple each morning and bake croissants for people. One hot afternoon in 2005, a refrigerated truck pulled up on the playa, and a crew jumped out and started serving ice cream to people. There was no branding on the truck or the cones that they were handing out to people. But I happened to recognize this man on the right. That's Ben Cohen. He's one half of Ben and Jerry's. Longtime burner. And here's another amusing example of gifting at its finest. These guys were offering to lube people's bikes, including mine, using bacon grease from back at camp. The gift economy is a very interesting aspect of Burning Man. When people give freely without any expectation of return, it creates a lot of positivity all around. And also, when we're on the receiving end of an act of spontaneous generosity, we tend to pay that forward by being more generous to the next person we meet. So it can have a very powerful impact on a group of people. Another storyline is the power of intentional community design. The ephemeral metropolis known as Black Rock City, with its 70,000 inhabitants, is designed around open spaces, around public art, around people-friendly plazas. It's designed for pedestrians, people on bikes rather than cars. And it's designed to maximize the number of spontaneous encounters between people. There's a whole literature now on the power of spontaneous exchanges and how they're one of the keys to good urban planning. As an experiment, go to Burning Man and count the number of strangers you meet in a day. And then compare that to the number of strangers you meet on a typical workday at home. I think the number will surprise you. I'll come back to these different themes or dimensions of Burning Man, these alternative storylines, if you will. But let me say a few words about this project of mine and how it evolved. When I got back from Burning Man that first year, actually the second year, first year that I started actively taking pictures, I felt that it wasn't enough just to post a group of images online. I wanted them to say something. I had the sense that if I selected the images carefully and sequenced them just right, that they might speak together as a series. And I decided to post 100 of my best images on my website. I called it a photo essay, but there was no actual text, no captions. And, I put a fair amount of intention into all of this. But still, it was a pretty modest little project. And bear in mind that it was the early 2000s, and the world wasn't yet overrun by Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Not every photographer had his or her own website. There were plenty of photographers at Burning Man, but very few who posted images of the event online after it was over. I might have been the only one who created an actual photo essay. And to my surprise, the photographs found an audience almost immediately. Some of the visitors to my site who had been to the event were looking to re-experience it through photos. I think that's pretty common after we get back to the default world. But it seemed to me that the majority of visitors had little or no prior knowledge of Burning Man. And as more and more people started discovering the images, photo editors and people working for newspapers and magazines started getting in touch asking to publish the images. A 9-page spread in Nevada magazine actually won a prestigious magazine award. This was just a year or so into the project. This photo, which I call Blue Lovers, was made in 2009, and it was featured on the cover of Common Ground magazine. In 2011, Ev Williams, the co-founder of Twitter, saw my photos from that year and shared a link with more than 1 million of his followers. That was an important milestone because the photos went viral, and soon I had so much traffic to my site that I couldn't keep up with all the email and the comments. In 1 week, I had actually 1 million unique visitors to my website. All of this exposure allowed my images to be seen by new audiences, people I'd never reached before. Book editors, gallery owners, museum curators, TV producers, even corporate ad people looking to license cool photos, which of course is not something the Burning Man organization allows. All of us professional photographers have to sign a contract to that effect prior to going out and shooting at the event. The photos also started to appear in more and more magazines. In 2012, Rolling Stone magazine invited me to cover Burning Man on assignment, something I did for 4 years. And in 2014, I put out a coffee table book, Burning Man, Art on Fire. This was a collaboration with writer Jennifer Reiser and fellow photographer Sydney Erthal. The book actually became an Amazon bestseller in several categories, which amazed all of us. And it also got quite a lot of attention in the media. We did a second expanded edition of the book in 2016. Well, I mention all of this exposure and media attention because it became clear to us at a certain point, it certainly became clear to me that Burning Man had become something of a phenomenon in the culture, a kind of touchstone. Now references to it were cropping up in song lyrics, on The Simpsons, and in speeches by President Obama. And yet this was the thing, the old media narratives didn't go away. It was still a general sense on the part of the news establishment that Burning Man was just a drug-fueled hippie rave in the desert. Other story angles that kept on showing up in the media was that Burning Man was, that it was somehow going mainstream, or that it was played out at some level, or that it was becoming too commercialized, which Fred also made reference to. I think, of course, that this is total nonsense. I mean, how can an event where nothing is for sale be too commercialized or too commercial? Well, I knew more than to think that I alone could change anybody's perceptions of what Burning Man is, but what I could do perhaps was to try to be very intentional about what I was doing out there and what I was photographing and the perspective that I was offering people of what was actually going on out there in the desert. I'll go back to that moment that an editor from Rolling Stone contacted me in 2012. That may sound like a dream assignment, but I was actually very reluctant to shoot for Rolling Stone when they first contacted me. A friend of mine, a fellow Burning Man photographer, had covered the event for Rolling Stone in 2004. He'd worked his tail off out there, told me that he'd used up a lot of social capital making photographs that were difficult to get. He asked for special favors from pilots so he could get cool aerial photos. He pleaded with crane operators to give him special views of the playa from 40 feet up in the air, and pestered art car drivers, like this one, to get inside their rigs and see what it looked like inside and under the hood. Well, after he submitted his photos, he found that the editors had paired them with a short write-up written by some in-house writer in New York City who'd never been to the event that was deeply critical of Burning Man. It was being used in service to some snarky article about a freak show in the desert. And he was devastated by this. And a lot of his friends at Burning Man felt that the coverage was a kind of betrayal. So when I got the call from Rolling Stone, I said that I'd only want to cover the event for the magazine if they gave me their assurance that the coverage would be fair and even-handed. Well, they couldn't promise that. So I said, well, how about if I write the captions? And the editor thought about it for a bit, and eventually we came to an agreement that they would write the headline and the lead, and I would write the captions. You see what they came up with. This turned out to be a very challenging assignment for me. It forced me to think very carefully about what I was doing out at Burning Man. For one thing, I realized that most of the readers of Rolling Stone had never been to Burning Man, and they probably just heard about it online or heard references to it in the media. And for this reason, I tried to avoid some of the more hackneyed themes and always try to ask myself, what am I trying to communicate here? What's the story here? And I became a lot more focused on what I saw as the essence of Burning Man and why it's significant. It made the gig a lot harder, but also more rewarding, I think, from a creative standpoint. So let me just say a few things about what for me is at the heart of Burning Man. A favorite book of mine is An Act of Creation by Arthur Koestler, the British writer and novelist. And he devoted years of study to creativity in science and the arts, and actually did some excellent work at Stanford in the 60s. And he observed that our minds are constrained to think within limited contexts or frames of reference. And creativity, as he described it, was the coming together of seemingly unrelated frames of reference. Now, the creative act plays out differently in comedy, in science, and in the arts. In comedy, it takes the form of a collision. You're following the story along, and then comes the punchline, and you realize that you're not in the context that you thought you were. In science, the creative act takes the form of a synthesis. And in the arts, the creative act takes the form of a juxtaposition. Kessler had a very clever way of describing the effect of this process. In comedy, he said, the reaction it produces is ha ha. In science, the reaction it produces is aha. In the arts, the reaction it produces is ah. Now, you see these reactions everywhere you go at Burning Man, because the event is all about juxtaposing incompatible frames of reference. The whole thing is a kind of theater of the absurd. A 16th century Spanish galleon gliding across the desert floor. A group of bankers in dusty painter's overalls holding umbrellas and briefcases. An old country church tipped on its axis like a mousetrap. It's like walking around in a Salvador Dali painting. In fact, like so much of the art and the writing from the Surrealist period, what you see at Burning Man can be startling, unconventional, hilarious, mystifying, and also, in some deep sense, eye-opening. Even a bit psychedelic. I think a lot of what you see at Burning Man speaks to the power within all of us to create. We come into the world as immensely creative beings, but then our creativity tends to be bred out of us. So when as adults we arrive at a place like Burning Man that actively encourages us to participate, to create, to make, and to share, we become awakened to something that lies dormant deep within us. At Burning Man, the creativity is mind-boggling. Obviously, there's the art, but there are also flaming rhinos, bizarre, allegorical performance pieces, marauding bananas, drinking chess, burning pianos flying through the air, Burning Man makes artists of us all. And my own work certainly attests to that fact. But so does that of countless other people at Burning Man, many of them people who arrived at the event just like I did, reluctant to be there and somewhat bewildered. But there's another aspect of creativity that I want to touch on, and that's this idea of being freed from restrictive ways of thinking. Burning Man creates a context that sets people free to experiment with new modes of being. It frees us from social conventions and lets us let go of old identities. Or perhaps, as this woman, adopting new ones. Most of us, especially here in America, like to think that we're free because we live in a more or less free society. But we're trapped by our mental ideas and constructs. We live in a kind of bondage to habitual ways of thinking and perceiving the world. We live within these carefully constructed identity bubbles that don't leave much room for new growth. So there's something about going off the grid for a week that releases us from the confines of our usual identities. Kind of breaks us out, breaks open the head, as Daniel Pinchbeck put it. Allows us to shatter our sense of limitation And at Burning Man, you see this process playing out in 1,000 different ways. It could mean adopting a special playa name, Queen Yummy, or assuming a different persona for each day of the week, each with its own name and set of outfits. For others, it could mean pushing the boundaries of their sexual orientation, or venturing out beyond the boundaries of their comfort zones. Now, how we choose to break out of our thought prisons is, of course, a very personal thing. But the fact is that we need safe contexts in which to do it. And there are very few public places where that's even allowed, let alone encouraged. I think for some people there's freedom simply in being nobody in particular. I've struck up some of the most remarkable conversations with strangers at Burning Man, only to learn deep into a long, heartfelt conversation that they're wealthy entrepreneurs, prominent architects, nuclear physicists, sex workers, professors at elite colleges and universities, Bollywood movie stars. One time I had an hour-long conversation with someone I later learned was the crown prince of a Scandinavian country, future king. One of the core principles of Burning Man, of course, is the idea of radical self-expression. And some people take that to mean defying convention in some way, like dressing up in a wacky outfit, doing something daring in public. But once you've run around in the desert wearing nothing but bunny ears and a tutu for a few days, the thrill wears off. And at that point, you have to reach within yourself to find some experience, some capacity, some creative spark that connects with what makes you feel alive inside. And to discover that takes courage. And I think that's what Larry Harvey was referring to when he spoke of radical self-expression. We need places, contexts in our culture where we can discover those capacities, where we can free ourselves from the shackles of our social and professional roles. And I think many of us get this at an intellectual level, but the fact is that there's a place where for 1 week out of the year we can experience this at an experiential level. And that's a different thing altogether. Then it's not just an abstract notion, it's a visceral experience. Burning Man represents a kind of skunkworks, a laboratory of creative possibility. And I think that we're already seeing how some of the design characteristics that go into the event are starting to inform and inspire changes in society at large. In the way we design our towns and cities, the way we structure ritual and play into everyday life, the way we think about public art, how we can limit the commodification of everyday life, and how we can create pathways for people to come together, to make things, to support and learn from one another, and how to create community around the things that we love. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I was a little daunted at coming out here and following up after Scott, because usually I can use all of his brilliant images in my presentations and nobody pays any attention to anything I have to say. But in any event, my name is Nora Atkinson. I'm the acting curator in charge of the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And as many of you know, last year we opened a groundbreaking exhibition called No Spectators, The Art of Burning Man, that highlighted the large-scale participatory work of the annual event. There's my slide. Okay. This was not the first museum exhibition to cover the event. Nevada Museum of Art and a number of others, the Hermitage Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, have done exhibitions, but this was certainly the largest and most comprehensive show, and the first one on a real national stage at a major museum. So it brought up a lot of questions about how you interpret Burning Man within the museum, and that's what I wanted to talk to you all today about. And I thought the easiest way to do that was to tell you a little bit about my personal journey and how this collaboration came together, and then a little bit about the exhibition itself. So I'm going to largely skip over the history of Burning Man and talk to you about that. So I imagine when Burning Man began in 1986 at the naked end of Baker Beach, Larry Harvey and Jerry James never dreamed where it would lead: into the desert, into a city of 70,000 people, and into a worldwide movement being celebrated in a national art museum. Particularly because, needless to say, Burning Man did not start out as an arts festival, and to characterize it that way and put it into that box today would be a misrepresentation. There may have been a performative aspect from the very start, but it wasn't really until maybe the last 15 years or so that this increasingly large-scale, complex, participatory work really became the hallmark of the event. And even though it wasn't part of Burning Man's original DNA, I think today it offers a window into the culture that shows Burning Man at its very aspirational best. Particularly if any of you have had the opportunity to be there at the event on Playa during Build Week, you know what I mean. You get a chance to see the collaborative community in action. It's the antithesis of that plug-and-play camp idea, as Scott mentioned. This is when people are there really just to build the work, and many of them even leave right after that point. So they're people working for days, months, even years to create a whole imaginative experience of wonder for everyone around them. Now, for me, this story begins in an entirely different place. I'd heard for years about Burning Man from many of my friends, but I was not a burner when all this began. In 2010, I was working at a museum called Bellevue Arts Museum in Bellevue, Washington. It's sort of a mid-sized museum of art, craft, and design in that region. And I was working on an exhibition around the theme of catastrophe. And it seems a little quaint to think about it actually now, but it felt like there were an awful lot of awful things happening in the world. Hurricane Katrina was on everyone's mind. The Iraq War was continuing with no end in sight. And I was interested to see how artists were responding to that, and maybe even with a little bit of morbid curiosity. But I was working on the exhibition, and I wasn't really happy with how it was coming out. And then in the midst of my research, something happened. I went down to Art Basel, Miami. Probably some of you have been there. And if you've been there, you know the entire city sort of lights up with glamorous parties and celebrities and expensive artworks. And there are dozens of satellite fairs, and it's really the entire town. And there's so glitz and glamour and spectacle everywhere. But after a few days, you feel like there's very little substance there. And I was feeling overwhelmed by the commercialism of that and the superficiality of it all. I was feeling a little empty, particularly in light of the subject that I was trying to work on. And it drove me into a little bit of an existential crisis about why I was in the art world at all and why any of this mattered. So as I was experiencing my existential crisis, as luck would have it, a photographer and art hero of mine, Vic Muniz, was premiering his film Wasteland that year at the festival, and I attended. Wasteland, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a documentary feature about a project Muniz created in his native Brazil to give back. He worked with the lowest caste of people there, the catadoras, the garbage pickers, and he created monumental portraits, heroic portraits of those people. And at the end of the project, working with them and photographing those portraits, he ended up donating the proceeds of the project back to those people. And so sitting there in the darkened theater, I had my little epiphany, and I realized that the reason that my show wasn't working was that I was focusing on entirely the wrong thing. What the world needed was not another art historical treatise. It didn't need to dwell on the negativity of everything that was going on. What it needed was this. It needed redemption. It needed inspiration. It needed a call to action. It needed a feeling that you weren't helpless and that you could do something about it. So that blurry picture over there on the right is what happens when you fangirl out and you meet Vic Muniz and you ask a stranger to take a picture of the two of you together. So at any rate, I came back from Miami motivated, and I pivoted the direction of that exhibition, and it became an exhibition that I called Making Mends, which was about healing through art. And it's a show today that I'm very proud of, and here were just a couple of the artists that were featured in that show in addition to Vic Muniz. That's on the left, Motoya Yamamoto, a Japanese artist who works in salt. In the center Jennifer Zwick, a Seattle photographer, and on the right, a Bay Area artist that some of you might know, Aaron Toole, who's one of my personal heroes, who creates these cups and he gives them away, and in fact, he has given these away at Burning Man. During the research for that show, I also became obsessed with the work of David Best and the Temple crew, and I started to see these images and read about what was going on out in the desert, and I desperately wanted to have David in this show, but I couldn't think of any way that it could actually happen. It couldn't happen through photos or video. It had to be some kind of an immersion. So that did not happen. But it got into my head. And one day I said to my colleague Stefano, you know, we should do a show about Burning Man. And he said, no, you just want to go. And we laughed. But because how could you anyway? It's just a bunch of hippies doing drugs in the desert, as we all knew. And isn't all the artwork huge and dangerous, and doesn't it all get burned afterwards? So we figured it wasn't really possible. But those ideas that make you laugh and terrify you are always the best ideas. And so it stuck there. So fast forward, and in 2014, I was hired by the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian, and I moved from Washington to Washington just as the museum was headed into a 2-year renovation. And I went through this east-west culture shock, going from a small museum in the Seattle area, a place with no real history or national stage, to the Smithsonian. And I immediately began to think about how I was going to use this new platform and what perspective I, as a West Coast girl, could bring to this stage uniquely. So if you're not familiar with DC, I also want to tell you just a moment about the Renwick. Renwick is truly a special place. Unlike most Smithsonian museums, which are all on the National Mall, the Renwick is actually located kitty corner to the White House, right next to Blair House. You can see it in that picture, right on Pennsylvania Avenue. We're housed in an 1860s Second Empire building that was built by James Renwick for William Wilson Corcoran's original gallery of art. And it was not an accident that Corcoran located the museum where he did. He was passionate that the fledgling United States needed to make distinct achievements in arts and culture as much as industry and trade if it was going to become one of the great nations of the world. So he built this building in sight of the White House to serve that purpose as a reminder. The museum first opened its doors in its current incarnation as the Renwick Gallery in 1972 as the Smithsonian American Art Museum's branch dedicated to contemporary craft. But by the time I came on board in 2014, our field had begun to acknowledge that the American studio craft movement was on the wane. And my colleague Nicholas Bell and I were tasked with rethinking what it meant to be a museum dedicated to craft, post-studio craft for the new millennium. I should say for my part, I hold the conviction that there's no more exciting time to be in this field. When we talk about modern craft, we usually pinpoint as its beginning the Industrial Revolution, when the idea of handmaking became a choice, and thinkers like William Morris and John Ruskin were worried that craft would disappear in the face of mechanization, taking a piece of the human spirit with it. But craft persisted all this time in a slightly different form. So as we move into the digital revolution, I think that craft has renewed relevance as a counterweight, as a means of commenting on humanity's relationship with technology, as a way of providing comfort and reminding us to slow down and connect, less about efficiency, more about people. So Nicholas and I began formulating a new identity of the Renwick around craft as a philosophy of living in the modern world. Instead of focusing on skill and traditional 5 media, this was more of a fluid concept about material and process, about the embedded history of useful objects, and the notion of David Pye's workmanship of risk, the idea that human agency could be involved at every step of the making process to make something unique and meaningful. And we broadened the work that we were showing. This is several images from our reopening exhibition Wonder, which featured 9 contemporary artists creating room-size installations for the museum, among them Leo Villarreal, who you all know from the Bay Lights and as a Burning Man artist. So for all those reasons, Burning Man was on my mind. And I realized this was an opportunity to be the first museum to tell the story of this incredible movement that's more than 30 years old. This was not a splash in the pan. And yet it had been left out of the American story and overlooked by the art establishment because it was problematic, because it had anarchist roots, because it was huge and dangerous and secretive and populist and uncurated and hard to commodify, and any number of other reasons, all anathema to that world, and something I coincidentally could relate to as a craft curator. I mused that in a way, Burning Man was the anti-Art Basel. You think about it. 70,000 people, the beach, the playa, east-west. Only one revolves around money and the other revolves around community. And I thought this was something that the art world may want to pay a little attention to. That the art is popular speaks to the non-art audience, and speaks to a non-art audience should not leave it out of the story of art. And what I loved most about it from my geeky curator perspective was that it honored craft's role alongside technology. Gone here was the anxiety that craft was going to die out at any moment. Here it blended seamlessly with technology into maker culture. At Burning Man, they were so sure that this was going to survive that they burned it all down and started over again the next year. So in early 2016, after the museum reopened with Wonder, I proposed to No Spectators as my first large-scale project for the museum. My then director wasn't sure what this burning tree thing was, but she gave me the yellow light to go ahead and pursue it under the guise that it was going to be just a small show featuring a little costume and jewelry and a couple of installations. And over a period of time, that obviously grew. I then reached out to the Burning Man organization, and Harley Dubois, one of Burning Man's founders, answered. And I gave her a heartfelt pitch about how our values aligned and why I thought this could work. As a free museum open to the public 364 days a year, Smithsonian lived the principles like radical inclusion and gifting and civic responsibility every day. So we wanted to try to expand our capability and see what could happen. The real question was, could the Smithsonian, with all of its history and pedigree and bureaucracy, literally part of the federal government, embrace a group founded on challenging the status quo and living outside the bounds of our society? And could we pull off something entirely outside our comfort zone? And could Burning Man, this group of idealists and pranksters, doers and dreamers, enter the institution without losing its soul? But Burning Man has always thrived on contradiction, and at Burning Man, anything is possible. All you have to do is just do it, right? So we decided to give it a go. It somehow seemed to make sense. But even just from a theoretical point of view, how do you express the complexity of city and do right by a culture that's more than 30 years old? How do you quickly enculturate people of all walks of life who may have never heard of Burning Man or have only heard the most salacious details to convince them that this is more than just escapism? How do you keep people from being spectators to really inspire the kind of creativity and play and connection that defines Burning Man within the bounds of the museum? It was a complex problem. First, it was important to get the community involved. So with the Burning Man organization's help, and particularly Affinity, because I know you're here, it was an amazing volunteer at Burning Man, we reached out to the greater Burning Man community to talk about what we were planning. We gathered suggestions from artists and makers. We listened to people's stories. We looked for support. The organization helped me arrange studio visits with dozens of artists, and at the same time we worked with our local regional Burning Man community to look for volunteers and get them on board, because we found that this was going to be a collaborative effort. In 2017, I also finally attended Burning Man for the first time. This is me with my brother out at Burning Man. And I gave a talk at the Artery about the upcoming exhibition so that we could bounce ideas off the community and get feedback. And actually, to my surprise, it was received very well. I didn't have a lot of critical input from the community. Also, to her great credit, I want to point out that we had a new director on board at that time, Stephanie Stevich, who she came out to one of the events and she said, "I'm going to go to Burning Man." And I thought, that is just what new directors say. You're never going to go out to Burning Man. But to her credit, she rode the Burner Express bus from San Francisco all the way to Playa, came out there to experience it herself. 8 hours on the Burner Express bus. It's commitment. So next we needed to acknowledge that this was a huge topic and we couldn't cover all of that territory. Curating is just as much about the things that you leave out as the things that you include, and this obviously needed boundaries. So I made the decision very early on that it was going to be the direct experience of art, not Burning Man culture and not art history, that had to take center stage. I thought if we made this about art history, it would become subservient to that. And that, I felt, would be a travesty, since this had been an entirely separate thing going on that really had its own soul. In the final show, I included very limited photography. There was video and there was film footage of installations on Playa, and those were mostly atmospheric to highlight some of the amazing photographers and whatnot who were working out there. But the vast majority of the work in the exhibition had to be large-scale installation and small-scale objects, and about experience, not about observing the culture. To put a little fire behind that conviction, I used the title as a challenge. Our prior exhibition, Wonder, had been an Instagram sensation. Our photography encouraged signs actually went viral. But with this show, I wanted to push the capability of the museum as far as I could push its limits. I didn't want people to come in and stand there and take pictures. So we called the show No Spectators, as a way of encouraging people to come in and actively get involved with the work inside, and also as a way of encouraging our own staff to allow for that. In the meantime, to give people a frame of reference, it turned out that serendipitously the Nevada Museum of Art was developing an archival exhibition on Burning Man's history at the same time. So working with them, we were able to embed that component called City of Dust into our own exhibition without compromising that focus on the art and on immediacy. In all this, it's worth emphasizing that the museum did not set out to be Burning Man, which I don't think would be possible, and I don't think it would serve a purpose. We have our own identity as the Smithsonian, and it was the coming together of these two distinct worlds that made this event special. That meant maintaining a balance, bringing a level of curation and connoisseurship while engaging and actively reflecting the community. It meant breaking certain Burning Man standards. We placed labels next to artwork and credited the makers. We have a gift shop that continued to run, although we tried to be sensitive to principles of decommodification, keeping any merchandise with the name Burning Man or the man out of the shop and focusing it on small makers. It meant placing certain limitations, like volunteers have to wear pants. It also meant pushing our own limits to align more closely with Burning Man principles and tear down that fourth wall between the artist and the audience. We couldn't allow people to climb on the art, but we could allow them to touch, enter, interact with, and in many cases add to it. We couldn't burn the temple, which had to be fireproofed to high heaven, but we could commit to burning all of the memories and testaments and messages that were left there, that most of which will go out to Burning Man this fall. To my great disappointment, we couldn't showcase a 3-story tall fire-breathing serpent mother or a giant skeleton-laden zoetrope, but we could acknowledge their importance through film footage and give them a physical presence in the gallery. So the exhibition set out to elevate the art, inspire wonder, and get people involved in the heart of DC without all the dust. We divided the exhibition into 6 loose sections to tell the story. As you entered, you encountered Michael Garlington and Natalia Bertotti's paper arch, which acted as a threshold to another world. The text told the almost mythic story of that first trip to the burning Black Rock Desert, of Michael drawing a line in the sand, proclaiming, on the other side of this line, everything's going to be different. And you learned about Burning Man's utopian anti-establishment dreams. You got a short primer on the lingo, and you began to understand. But this is an example of where we had to get creative in order to create a museum exhibition. Since Michael and Natalia's works, like Totem of Confessions, usually burned on playa, there was nothing left for us to show. So we commissioned paper arch, especially for the exhibition, and I think it was the perfect of both worlds. It reflected both the character of the playa and the museum. It was in the style of Totem of Confessions and some of their other works, but the triumphal arch was made specifically for our nation's capital. It had animals from our local natural history museum taking over. It had peepholes into other worlds, so it became the perfect entrance. From there, you moved through a gallery dedicated to the people, which make up the heart of Burning Man. At the center of the gallery was a 1/3 scale version of Marco Cochrane's Truth is Beauty that went on playa in 2011. This piece was towering in our space almost to the ceiling at 18 feet tall. The original was 55 feet tall. And it sort of set the tone, talking about the freedom of the culture. For a lighting designer, he got to play here. This moved through a 20-minute light cycle created with the artist, from transparent to opaque, and it gave it an air of theatricality, and it hinted at how these artworks change at different times of day, a little bit about the desert environment itself. And around that, we displayed small objects, more personal things that spoke to identity and community and individual relationships formed on playa. Costume, jewelry, patches, burner portraits. These, I think, helped to create a holistic sense of place, but we were careful not to include too many images of people out in the desert. This wanted to be about the objects, about translation through those, not an opportunity to look at these other people, but to understand how they were making and why. And I think this gave people a sense of the gifting culture and the dust and the need for lighting and any number of other things. Next was a section dedicated to the desert environment and to the mutant vehicles. Immediately you were confronted with Dwayne Flatmo's amazing Tin Pan Dragon, the precursor to the famous El Pulpo Mecanico that Scott showed a few minutes ago, and to Rapid Transit that's here. And we showed videos alongside this, so although we couldn't light anything on fire in the gallery, we were able to convey a little bit of that. This was the moment that I knew that my team was really on board with this exhibition, when Dwayne Flatmo came in to install his piece, and he got into a Tin Pan Dragon and began to move it around, and our registrars, who are tasked with the safety of the art, said, "Wow, can we really light it on fire?" Couple more. This is Roy 2000's beautiful video Lake of Dreams in the background. Richard Wilkes' wonderful bicycle. Scott Froschauer also with his street signs. And on the right, this is 5 Ton Crane's Capitol Theater. I had a problem in this exhibition. In the first place, I wanted to work with 5 Ton Crane, which is a collective of more than 80 artists from the Bay Area who've created projects like the Ray Gun Gothic rocket ship and Storied Haven for the playa, but there was nowhere that I could put those pieces. And simultaneously, I had another problem that there was no way that I could fit a full-size mutant vehicle into my building, and I was tearing my hair out over that. So I invited 5 Ton Crane to give me a few proposals for projects, and they came back with this one, and I fell in love. And so this is an example of a mutant vehicle that has never been out to Burning Man, and hopefully will go out there after this entire exhibition is done. This is a full-scale Prohibition-era movie theater on a double-decker bus, complete with 3 custom films, ceramic popcorn, candy, William Morris wallpaper, you name it. And this crew had to bring this piece in axle by axle and install it inside the building. So with each of these pieces, I should point out also that the audience was allowed to play. They could go up and spin Richard Wilkes' Zoetrope. They could walk up into Capitol Theater and enjoy the films, which invited them to talk with their neighbors and whatnot. So really a participatory experience for the museum. It's highly unusual for the Smithsonian to commission artworks, but for this show it was necessary on several levels. So in addition to those couple of works that we commissioned a temple from artist David Best that I'll show you in the moment, a full-scale functioning temple. And we also invited artist Android Jones to create a virtual reality experience that mirrors the virtual reality that he brings to Playa and that I had experienced there. And this let people experience his interpretation of the playa and immerse themselves and create with the wands. So this was an opportunity to give people a more empathetic experience of what it might be like and the vastness of the desert landscape. And as the counterpoint to that, we also included Candy Cheng's Before I Die, which was a whole installation in a gallery of these chalkboard walls. Before I die, I'd like to. And this is a project that she did not develop for Burning Man, but has brought out a couple of times and that received a grant from the Burning Man organization at one point. On the second floor of the museum, the corridor was flanked at one end by an 8-foot-tall version of the man and at the other by our temple. And I think this was the heart of the show and what I had been waiting for all those years. This was surrounded by immersive room-size installations and several monitors featuring video footage of installations at Burning Man, with Leo Villarreal's installation like Stars Overhead, which was a piece that we had acquired during the Wonder exhibition. So with this, I had created what I thought of as my own miniature version of the playa, where section texts explored themes about spirituality and the maker movement and Burning Man's connection with innovation and with Silicon Valley. Without question, this is the largest and most complex exhibition our museum has ever attempted. It was a fully participatory experience that broke the boundaries in almost every way, in scale, in the technology involved, in how we allowed our audience to respond, in working with our neighborhood, with the Secret Service and Parks Department, in how we raised money for the show, not putting large logos anywhere in the exhibition, in how we treated our gift shop, in working with our safety team who almost fainted when I just told them the title of the exhibition. So while you may think it's a daunting task to install these works in the desert, installing these works in a historic 1860s building is at least equally monumental a challenge. In the desert, there are no spatial limits, but for the Renwick, space is at a premium, and our loading dock is our front door. Artwork installations had to be staged room by room. There are no high winds to contend with, but there are floor load limits. And David Best and his team, some of whom are here today, had to carry their materials up our grand staircase because they wouldn't fit in the elevator, and then work around those in the space. So this exhibition took up our entire museum, and we closed the museum for an entire month to install it. During that time we had artists working pretty much all hours of the day, almost 7 days a week, filtering in and out, shifts of maybe up to 20 of David Best's crew on site every day. And it was actually absolutely glorious. And we made it happen with blood and sweat and tears, and this is how some of the artworks transformed in the museum. I think things that looked very small on Playa can become huge, and it was really a joy to see the sort of dancing shadows on the walls that you can't take advantage of out there in the desert. It elevated them and gave them a museum presence. We also had a chance to partner with our local neighborhood organization, the Golden Triangle, to put 6 sculptures in the area to convey the vastness and make our audience work for it. Here are some of those outdoor sculptures in Marco's Truth is Beauty, which added another technological layer to the show. We were able to work with Intel to create a virtual reality experience so I could guide people through the museum in real time. Sorry, I'm speeding up. Some more of that experience, and this was our opening party. This was a pioneering effort from so many people. It included upwards of 150 artists. We had over 800,000 visitors come to see the show. It was our most popular exhibition of all time, just beating Outlander, and it was crowded every single day. On a somber note, Burning Man's original founder, Larry Harvey, passed away only a short time after the opening of the exhibition, but we were fortunate enough to have him there to see this phase in his legacy, and I think it would have lacked something without that. Because even though Burning Man and its artists have never sought legitimacy after 30 years and so much growth, it was time for some recognition of their contribution to the world and the art world. So I wanted to thank the people who helped us make it happen. Today, the art at Burning Man is probably the most recognizable and highly anticipated features of the annual event. And although there has always been that uneasy relationship with the art establishment, regardless of certain critics' dismissive treats, it's hard to deny that this thing in the desert is having an impact. We in the art world, or any specialized field, I think, can become so insular that we lose contact and relevance with the world around us sometimes. Sometimes we need to open our eyes. Every morning I take the metro to work and I see more than 90% of the people staring at their cell phones or on their headphones, isolated in a crowd, and I think artwork that builds real human connection shouldn't be dismissed. So I'm proud we were able to bring it to the Smithsonian. I'm even more thrilled that it will be traveling to Cincinnati this spring and then coming here home to Oakland Museum this fall, which wasn't planned, but we're making it happen in grand Burning Man style. And I just wanted to conclude, because I'm only a short-time burner, I thought that many of these things were better said by someone from the community from a longer period of time. So conclude with Kate Rowdenbush, who best summed this up in our symposium last fall when she was asked how Burning Man artists feel about the art establishment.
Okay. Just a little bit to the art establishment, but because I actually don't really court the art establishment, because I'm very comfortable. We are very comfortable being part of the art underground, which happens to be at the Smithsonian. Na, 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 na. And it's a weird culture of competitiveness and asking permission. And I don't know. Yeah. I walk into galleries and I go, who is this person sleeping with to have such bad art in here? It's terrible. And, at Burning Man, I don't see that. It's all amazing, I think, in my opinion. But, yeah, and then what was the other question? What was the other part?
Are people's interactions and attitudes and expectations?
Well,
Is that shifting over 20 years? Or?
I think there's still an awestruck wonder. Okay. Still. You know what? People say, oh, but Burning Man is too commercial now. I'm like, it's not commercial. Do you see brands ever? No. It's just popular. But guess what? We need to be steeped in Burning Man culture. I think the default world needs more of what Burning Man has to offer.
All right, so I was asked to talk about the organizational aspects, the organizational underpinnings for the Burning Man event. And starting off with a very simple example of arts and creativity at Burning Man. You can see someone has decorated, this was during the year that the theme was evolution of the baby turning into the man. I just want to acknowledge and express gratitude to Stanford for providing me as an undergraduate. Where are the Stanford students? Are you still here? Yes. So what happened to me was I was a human biology major, and I had 1 or 2 classes left as an elective, and I happened to take a sociology class, and that's how I've launched into becoming a professional sociologist and a professor who happened to study Burning Man. So had it not been those extra credits, I don't know what would have happened to me. So here I am. Thank you to ArtsWest for bringing me here. Okay. So, I think this has already been raised in some of the prior presentations, but how many of you remember doing something like this when you were younger, right? Like, so much artwork, like they're bursting, like you don't know what to do with it, right? And at that time, it feels very natural, right? And it's something that is expected of you. And you're not just consuming the arts, you're actually producing it. And you're oftentimes immersed, at least early on, right, in a milieu that encourages this. You're in the outdoors, if you're lucky. You're in school art and music programs, if you have funding. You might have extracurricular programs. You have families who will ooh and ah over everything that you do, right? But what happens to creativity and artistry as you get older? This is actually something that will greet you if you go to the Yale Law School. This is, for those of you who can't see it, it's a professor and all the students are basically asleep, right? In our experience, the problem is like many of the institutions that we interact with, right? Museums, schools, universities, the state and its entities, and the professions can instill these beliefs that you as a layperson who have not specialized in the arts or creativity, however it's defined, you don't have the experience or the expertise or the worth, right, to do certain things. So many of us, creativity feels dormant, as I think Scott referred to. So you perceive limits on creativity in the arts, and you're constrained oftentimes by this definition. So if you look at like definitions of creativity and research, it's a very high bar. It has to be novel, right? Novel, that's a really high bar, right, to me. And it's oftentimes, people think of creativity as being an art or a property of a characteristic of an individual person, something that's inherent to that person. And if you're thinking about the arts in particular, oftentimes it's considered just the provenance, the domain of professionally trained artists, and maybe the occasional outsider artist who has a really compelling backstory. And only certain art forms are favored, right? Large-scale sculptures, paintings, maybe some video art, right? You have very limited venues for sharing the art. I think the previous presentation really shows you the constraints in the art world of the kinds of art that can be displayed, right, and experienced. So I've actually included one of my favorite kind of ephemeral art experiences, which is during the Deutsche Art Parade, when am I saying this right? Right? When 2007, it's a little bit hard to see, but these women are all joined together by braids. They're walking en masse down the street. This is, in the streets of Soho, New York City. Like, this is not like a typical, right, experience with the arts. And finally, to talk about the art world, where there's this perceived sense of artificial scarcity. Also, it happens in academia as well, where it's a winner-take-all stratified market where you get star artists, right, who get the recognition, and then, maybe there's some artists who, are also working on their artwork, but they're in this factory-like model working under the star artist, right? Okay, so, well, how can organizations, and I think this is something that people don't really want to think about because, you take organizations for granted. You're sort of like fish in the water, like swimming around. You don't really notice, how much organizations structure your life, structure your activities. So for many of us to think that organizations can actually help us reclaim our creative and artistic capacities is not something that we necessarily expect from organizations, right? If anything, we often expect them to suppress it. Right? But how can we get organizations to do this? So they can encourage our creativity by setting up certain conditions through goals and structures, offer opportunities. So, for most people, like their creativity is sort of expressed in organizations through workarounds, right? Trying to get around the rules to get something done. This is something that came, interestingly, out of a study of Harvard undergraduates around the time, I believe, that Mark Zuckerberg was developing Facebook. But some people believe that creativity isn't just like something that you produce that's tangible, right? It can actually include community and connection, right? Something that many people are starting to feel, missing in their lives. Right? So this is my inclusion, right? I would include community and connection as part of the creative process. And this final point is something I've just started thinking about more recently because I'm working on a research project that's, I blame Burning Man, right? So Burning Man has really launched me onto other research projects of thinking about something I had not anticipated when I first took a class on organizations. But there has to be a deschooling process, right? Where people shed their beliefs about their limitations, such as there's one right way of doing something. And for burners, it's, sitting inside your tent thinking, oh my God, what am I doing? Right? Or this process of realization of, for people like the media who are coming to the event that, wait a minute, it's just not the standard event. Like, there's very different things that are supposed to happen here. So how does Burning Man help people to practice what has felt unfamiliar to them? So essentially the organization behind the Burning Man event has set up enabling conditions that can help mediate. So I'm going to go over a bunch of things. It's sort of like an overview of the research I've done over the years. The first is to create an organization that's enabling, one that doesn't either under-support people with not enough structure and also does not overpower them with coercive authority and too much bureaucracy, for example. Also, there's duocracy, which decentralizes taking actions. There's also relational work, where people are focusing on relationships. This is something hard, I think, to depict pictorially, right? And also revaluing labor for the collective and using storytelling and rituals to provoke the imagination. And on the last two parts, I will also talk about how the principles have fostered dialogue and action. And finally, the dissemination of Burning Man has offered more people the chance, those who cannot come to the actual event, to experience the unfamiliar. Okay, so this is my brief lit review slide. I purposely tried to tailor this for an audience that's not just Stanford students, but also people who may not have had have the patience to sit through a lit review. But I've noticed many of you have been sitting rather attentively. I don't see too much like looking at your phones, right? Thanks to many years of schooling, you've already been trained by organizations to sit there quietly, right? So you've been trained to undertake certain kinds of actions and embody essentially certain kinds of values. So I've just selected, this as an example. So we know, organizations will do a number of things to help you channel your activities into a desired direction. And I've selected the example of prosumption, what some people call prosumption, right? Where now, at certain kinds of organizations, you as the customer are actually taking on the labor of the organization without necessarily getting savings in return. So I pulled this example from a restaurant that's in San Francisco, I believe. I've never been there, right? So there's, you have to take responsibility for doing the ordering, picking up your food, right, and then bussing your table. I think there was already references to social media, right, that now we're producing our own content, right? We're doing the work for social media organizations, right? So you're already learned through teams, right, to do certain kinds of things that organizations have valued and, routinized for you. Okay. Well, let's turn to the example of Burning Man and its organization. As we've seen already, it's known for enabling co-creative destruction of the art, where people collaborate to both produce and consume art. Sometimes consuming is done through fire. Much of the art is interactive, site-specific in many cases because the dimensions allow for that in many ways that other standard art venues do not. And also it's ephemeral. Right. And usually the artwork is not intended to be commoditized for museums, art galleries, or other markets. And I've included a picture actually from one of my interviewees who said, you know, if you can imagine it, basically at Burning Man, like you can find cool stuff. Like this is a bar that specializes in serving stilt walkers, right? So you're going to find that. Okay. So for those of you, who are used to seeing the standard lecture, so I had to talk briefly about my research methods. So the story starts back in 1998. At that time, the Burning Man organization already had a website. So I found the one email I could find on the website, and it turned out it was Marian Goodell's email. And I said, I'm Harvard graduate student. I'm interested in studying the organization. Would it be possible to come? And I wasn't quite sure what the response was going to be. And the answer was yes, but I would have to volunteer. So you can find me somewhere in this picture, right? So it wasn't just observations. I had to do participant observations. This included, going to meetings. So for many of you, probably this idea of doing research by going to meetings is probably your nightmare, right? But in the Burning Man context, this was a very different kind of experience. And also going to things like trainings, orientations. I also interviewed 81 organizers, past and present, as well as volunteers, and also did archival research. And I continue to think about this case as I currently work on my research project in New York, which is looking at democratic practices in a school in the educational field. So I continue to think about the things that I've observed at Burning Man. Now, many of you are probably thinking, well, like there's an organization for Burning Man, right, for example. Well, what does it look like? It looks like an extreme case because of the kinds of things it produces, but many of the issues that the organization faces are things that are commonly, experienced in other kinds of organizations. Like, how do you recruit people? How do you get them to stay? How do you motivate them? How do you coordinate competing demands with other organizations? So many of the seemingly unique aspects actually can help us understand the challenges that face other kinds of organizations or confront other organizations. So as you know, the event started in 1986. About 20 people, co-founders Larry Harvey and Jerry James, moved to the Black Rock Desert in 1994. And as the event grew, there were more and more coordination issues, so they developed a more formal organization. Some of you may remember back in 1995, it had a 3-person partnership and then turned into a limited liability corporation in 1997. That's 98 is where I started studying the organization. And since then, a nonprofit organization has formed and taken over the coordination of the event. The organization now does have a full-time staff, and it's still dependent, right? It is a nonprofit organization. It does rely heavily, and as it did then when I did study, when it was still a for-profit form, depend on volunteers and participants to carry out the majority of the event. Okay, so some of you may have heard this quote from Michael, that the Burning Man event is surfing the edge of chaos. So one of the things that the organization has to do is make sure that it has enough enabling conditions to help support the number of people who come to the event to put on their art project, to put on their theme camp, maybe just have a general camping experience. But what does that look like? So many organizations tend to do the opposite. They tend to put a lot of rules, right, on people, and members don't really have the authority to act. They're oftentimes waiting for a manager to tell them what to do. Other kinds of organizations, such as startups, usually have the other problem, new organizations where there's not enough structure to support people. And in fact, if you go back to 1997 or 96, people were quite worried at that time whether there was sufficient organizing structures in place to help support people who were coming to the event. Okay. Another aspect of the organization, so some of you are already familiar with this, is the duocracy, right? So with an event of this scale, right, so I think there was a reference to Skunk Works earlier. Many conventional organizations, you have a manager, and you have to blame essentially the business schools, right, for telling you that managers should be here and that they're the main ones who should have the power to tell people what to do, right? And so as a result, sometimes the frontline workers have to kind of work in secret to get things done, right? Well, at Burning Man, managers actually serve as support. They're not there to just say, okay, top down, here's what should happen. So if any of you've had the pleasure of working with Harley, she describes her philosophy as the following, that her attitude towards volunteers is to let people go out there and try it, give them the information. So you as a manager, right, your job is to give them information, help them make educated decisions, and understand that they're probably going to make mistakes, right, and they're going to figure it out. And in fact, it may take several iterations before they're actually going to be able to successfully pull off some kind of project, whether it's the arts or whether it's some kind of volunteer-based project. Oh, by the way, I should add, so this is the Temple of Forgiveness. We've already seen an image of it not unburnt before. But that's an example of a large-scale art project. Okay, so duocracy promotes organic growth, right? So that's how the organic growth was described to me as, things happen, things emerge, right? Out of how people identify a civic need, and they start to run a project themselves. It's not driven by manager. So oftentimes, civic needs are identified because people are frustrated by something or they feel that something is missing, right? So here's like the Black Rock post office where this group decided that this city needed a post office, so they actually pick up mail and then run it into an actual post office to be delivered. And successful volunteer-driven projects actually over time become recurring projects. So things like Playa Information, I know some people are here who are volunteered for Playa Information, for example, including myself. That arose out of a question and answer service. Somebody felt, Absenthia felt, that there was a need for a place for people to be able to come and ask questions, even when it was very basic, like, what is the playa? It's the thing you're standing on, right? Or what time does the man burn? Which, that's a reasonable question, right? Other things like recycling camp, again, another volunteer-driven project. The Temple Art Project, right? So the image that you saw before, David Best felt that there needed to be a place for people to experience some kind of ritual of mourning, right? And this has become a recurrent project. So you have the invitation to actually act and do, rather than be told what to do or what not to do. And from the observations I had of the volunteer trainings, here's an example that volunteer coordinator Molly Turpak explained, that you gave people invitations to contribute by inviting them to share their ideas, rather than saying, here's what we should do, right? Extending invitation to ask people, what should we do? Okay. And she observed at the meeting that oftentimes, you don't know what to expect, and that people will rise to the occasion. And in fact, if you think about it, many people, felt very frustrated by their workplaces, right? And in fact, many of those areas that they could not express in their organizations elsewhere, right, including volunteer-based organizations like museums, they could actually exercise that at the Burning Man organization. All right. So I know many people talk about tourists or spectators, the newcomers who supposedly come to Burning Man and ruin it, right? So even spectators, because of the kinds of things that they can experience and observe, can become participants, right? They can actually live up to the principles. So here's a story by Joel Bullock, who describes how initially this guy who seemed like a local rednecky guy showed up, was treating it just like a party, popping over the beer cans. By the end of the event, he was tracing designs in the dust that had accumulated on his car. And so he had experienced a transformation already from a spectator into a participant. So the transformation can be unintentional. So the event, because of the principles about inclusion, the emphasis on participation, it also allows for an expansion of ideas about creativity and artistry, right? So now, here's a quote from Larry Harvey, right? Some of you may have seen this as the laser, right? There's been several laser displays at Burning Man. He has a quote, we have people like Russell Wilcox, who has no background in art. He's an engineer at Lawrence Livermore Labs, National Laboratories. And in fact, if you Google Russell Wilcox, you can find very technical articles online explaining, how does he set up these lasers, right? So here he's interacting the laser with the Temple of Joy. Okay. People who come to the event oftentimes are inspired to try art and creative volunteerism. So this is Mary Ellen Birdwood. Some of you may know her as Dirt Witch. She described her first Burning Man experience as realizing, I can do art, I can do this, I can share. And so she actually did a ritual. And she also became a Black Rock Ranger. You can see here she's designed her own costume that incorporates khaki, but she's expressing another aspect of herself in her costuming. Another dimension of the organization underlying the Burning Man event, and this is, again, harder to depict with pictures, but encouraging relational work, encouraging people to form relationships and maintain these relationships, in some cases end the relationships when they don't go well, right? But this really animates this creative community. So, as you know, in very challenging circumstances, the best plans go awry. So one of my favorite quotes is, plan your burn your plan, right? So Larry Harvey was recounting how one artist was not able to finish his art piece at the event by the week's end, and he said, he advised me, you really needed to get helpers. You needed to find helpers, cultivate helpers. And he said, it's not enough to be Jesus. You need to have disciples to help you. At another meeting, a volunteer, Carrie Henderson, would announce that artist Dan Dossman has started offering free classes, classes for free about welding, right? So that anyone can come, anyone can learn to weld, right? How many of us get these invitations to actually help in art projects like this, right? So, this is maybe a little bit of a commentary of what's happening in the Bay Area. So my understanding is he's moved away to Los Angeles, right? Because he lost his studio space, right? So you can see an example of his artwork here. All right. So this relational work doesn't just happen at the event itself. So the Burning Man Project has encouraged people to start developing connections also in their local default world, right? This is their everyday societies. And some of this is done through the regionals, where people want to put on their own events. Some of them actually form their own organizations. For 2 years, the Burning Man Project supported the Circle of Regional Effigies, local art projects that people would build in their own communities and then bring to the event itself to burn. You probably may have heard Burners Without Borders, sorry, I misspelled it, that have applied their community building practices in areas that have been hit by natural disasters. So many of the skills and practices that we learn in building the event are applicable actually to disaster areas. And it's not just rebuilding communities physically, it's also rebuilding them through gathering people around the arts or learning something new. And finally, we do have the leadership summits that the organization also hosts around the world to help develop people's abilities to form these connections in their local communities as well. And these can also in turn launch local projects as well. Okay, so both at the event and off the event, this kind of work can help sustain communities, especially when people confront challenges. So I have a quote here from someone who had made a 80-foot mud labyrinth at the event. And as many of you know, again, right, when you're at the event, you have extreme weather conditions, you're not protected, right, from the elements. And he was devastated when a storm destroyed his labyrinth. And so he described actually going out the next day to start repairing it and realizing that someone had fixed it and it was even better than he had originally made it. And so he comes back to and says, starts telling this story, and then realizes is actually somebody he knows, right, through volunteering, had gone back and actually repaired it for him, and he felt this is one of the best things that had happened to him at his experiences at Burning Man, right, the unexpected help. So I think Nora touched on this a bit, that one of the things that Burning Man has done, and I think also Scott as well, is that has expanded notions of creativity and artistry beyond the commodified markets that many of us experience, right? So if you talk to many artists who have brought art projects to Burning Man, they felt it's liberating compared to places like New York, where people have to really focus on whether or not something is marketable, versus at Burning Man, they can actually focus on something they might quite enjoy. So where else can you get someone who's a carpenter and someone else, so the carpenter being Jerry James, right? And the landscaper, Larry Harvey, right? Constructing something that and has now become an iconic sculpture for a large-scale arts community. The other aspect of the Burning Man event, because it is done out in the open, people can actually experience the process of creating art, right? So the chance to go up to an artist, something that would normally be done behind the doors in a studio, right? The chance to come up to an artist as they're doing the art, help or have questions. So I've included a photograph of somebody who I just ran into, and she explained to me the significance of her art, which was she had a biracial daughter, and she was thinking through what the future would be like for her daughter. And that's what had motivated her to bring this art piece. And, you know, had it been in standard place, I don't know if I would have gotten that kind of explanation. Interactive art also has a life beyond Burning Man. This is one of my favorite installations, right? So the Hug Deli, where it continues to offer long, uncomfortable hugs and other options, right? At the end of the Santa Monica Pier in California, right? So we're starting to see the infiltration of this creativity beyond the Burning Man event. So for many people, this is a chance to start to reconnect with the collective. So I'm gonna just go with the last quote here. So for many people, people feel that they're only gonna do work, right, if they're paid, right? This is capitalism. Molly Turpak described going up to a woman and just saying, you know, we need someone to help build the man. Could you help move the hay bales? And the person was like, yes, I get to build the man, right? And so in this context, right, something that's normally viewed as menial labor actually becomes something very meaningful, right? Something that connects you to the community. The other aspects are storytelling and rituals as sparking creativity, right? So even things that are now dormant. So this is a ritual by Kimrick Smith. He would dress up as Java Cow and greet people at the Man at dawn and serve them coffee, right? No milk, apparently no sugar, right? So these kinds of rituals can spark storytelling, and the storytelling itself can help inspire people to rethink, right, how they can be creative. And this can lead people to actually doing things as well. The last part I want to talk about is the principles. The principles can also encourage people to reflect on their actions, and this is something I think that Burning Man really excels about, because we have at the event, right, the articulation of certain kinds of values. This allows people to actually discuss things that in conventional societies oftentimes left unspoken, right? And if you saw Marion's last blog post, right, about the course correction concerning the plug and play or concierge camps, right? These principles actually provide a space to think about where do you want to head collectively as a society. So what is the future of Burning Man? Well, most likely it's going to be beyond the Black Rock Desert itself through its offshoots, including places like Figment, right? And as people seek to bring the principles to their everyday life, we're likely to see it infuse the everyday world as well. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
So this concludes our formal program today. Let's give our presenters another round of applause, please. We invite you to attend the next free public program in the ArtsWest series as listed in the back page of the printed program. It takes place on May 20th at Stanford University, and it's free and open to the public. Thank you very much.